Hello and welcome to this episode of Superhero Ethics. One topic that Riki and I dance around a lot is the topic of one topic that comes up a lot because it's a big deal in superhero media is the idea of redemption or of hero turns or of what happens when a villain becomes an anti-hero, becomes a hero, becomes an ally, or any of the like. Riki earlier this week sent me a YouTube video that I really liked called Ranking Superheroes by How Many Villains They Redeemed by Anthony Gramuglia. I hope that I'm pronouncing that right. If anyone knows him or if he winds up watching this, please let me know if I did that wrong. But the idea of it talks about like which different heroes tend to the word they use, and we'll talk about that, is redeem different heroes, and what is it about certain heroes?
Villains.
Sorry, certain villains. Thank you. And what is it about their storylines or their character or any of the like that leads some heroes to do this more or less? And we're going to have this discussion. I think as part of it, we're going to be kicking off kind of a longer series that will be revisiting a bunch on what really do we mean by terms like redeemed and redemption arc and stuff like that. That we'll kind of get into a little bit today, but probably do a lot more in a later episode. But Riki, let me just start by asking you, what about this video really struck you and made you want to talk about it?
Just the fact that I think in the opening, one of the clips they use is of Batman from Batman.
You frozen me there for a second. God damn it.
You
You frozen
back?
me. Yeah, okay. Can you start that again from you were saying one of the clips is from Batman?
Yeah, what I liked is at the beginning of the video, they use a clip from the cartoon Batman the Animated Series. And it's the episode where Harley Quinn is having a bad day
Yeah.
and basically leads to her getting into criminal situations. But
Mm-hmm.
throughout it, like Batman still is trying to help her. And at the end, like they had this conversation that's clipped in this video where Batman ends up saying like something like everyone has a bad day.
Right.
And it's not like forgiving Harley Quinn, but it's kind of like an understanding and a reconciliation between them. That's
Yeah.
really beautiful for a superhero cartoon between a hero and a villain who have been at such odds with each other to have this moment where they're like, yeah, it, shit happens,
Yeah.
basically.
Very much so. And I think that particular line is so vital because that's a theme through a lot of the Batman stories. You know, both the killing joke and Joker kind of feeling like anyone could have a bad day and it could turn them bad, and this being kind of the opposite of that. Batman sort of saying like people shouldn't be defined by their one bad day or things like that.
Yeah, and I think specifically in this episode, Harley was not trying to do crime. She was trying to like be live straight, but then
Right.
kept getting into situations like I was getting frustrated. Like I'm not trying to do this. Like this is not who
Right.
I want to be anymore.
Right.
And I think that is what Batman was responding to,
Yeah.
is looking beyond the circumstances to her character and her motivation.
Very much so. And that it's funny. This could take us down a whole other topic line, but I think it's worth mentioning. You know, one of the things Batman is often accused of, and I think to some extent rightly so, but to some extent not so much, is the idea that he has all of these billions of dollars, and that if he really wanted to address crime, there's a lot of things he could do rather than like buy a lot of toys to punch up to punch poor people, bad guys. That that and if that sounds like an oversimplification, that's kind of the point. Is that's the way the argument is often made, and it can be more nuanced to be sure, but and I think especially in kind of the top level media that a lot of people are most exposed to, you know, the more casual fan, the movies and stuff like that, I understand where someone might get that impression, though I think it's not always the case. But certainly I think in things like Batman the Animated Series and a lot of the comic books and stuff like that, you have more of this kind of thing of Batman having more understanding of, yeah, people in hard situations often don't have many good choices with criminality being a lot of their available options, or that like in some other episodes, he has experiences with uh, there's the character Ace of Spades, and it's like the Spades Gang or something like that, the Royal Flush Gang.
Royal
Um,
Flush Gang, yeah, you're thinking of actually it's the Justice League cartoon
that's right, but it's mostly a
where he
Batman.
sits with her at the very end and just
Yeah,
basically talks to her until she passes.
yeah. Um, and that's again, she's someone who'd been doing a lot of harmful things, but he's kind of shown a lot of sympathy of her where she came from and how she was raised. Um,
And this is something I thought you were going down when you said like Batman is accused of or one of the
mhm,
critiques of him. But Batman is often accused of creating his villains, right? Like being the instigator that turns them into supervillains. And there again, the animated series even had an episode where he's put on trial for this
right,
by the Arkham inmates. But I think what that kind of ignores is how much effort Batman does put in to trying to pull them back from their
right,
villainy. Especially in this series, we saw the Harley Quinn thing. One of my favorite relationships is his relationship with Harvey Dent, Two Face. As Bruce
mhm,
Wayne, he's best friends with Harvey Dent,
yeah,
and it breaks his heart when he becomes Two Face. And there are future episodes after he's become a supervillain where he tries to help him rehabilitate
right.
and return to life as Harvey Dent.
I mean, just the fact that, and we can talk about this. This is again going to probably launch a number of related episodes. But just the fact that in Batman, the end result for most Batman stories is not to put people in jail, but to put them in Arkham Asylum.
Yeah.
And
A problematic place in its
a
own right.
deeply problematic place that comes from a really problematic understanding of mental health and also of stereotyping of mental health institutions. But just the fact that we're starting from an idea of these are people who are sick who need to be helped rather than these are people who are evil who need to be punished is in and of itself to me a huge statement of Batman's perspective on all these questions. Let me back up though for a second because for me one of the things that I most want to get into that I think you and I have discussed more that we won't really talk about too much this episode, but I think it's important to kind of name. In the video he says we're ranking superheroes by how many villains they have redeemed.
Mm-hmm.
And you and I have often talked about the idea that the term redemption or redemption arc is applied way too loosely. And I think that's going to be a whole episode in and of itself. Are you comfortable? Like, to me, a lot of the things that they talk about in this video, there are some that I think of as kind of redemption arcs in terms of characters who really come to understand what they did wrong, why it was wrong, and want to like make the world a better place as a way of making up for it. There's also people in the video who he names where it's which heroes are good at getting villains to be on their side out of their own self-interest or out of some kind of mutual self-interest or just a much broader view of these things that I feel like I want to refer to it as hero like face turns. You know, wrestler can make a heel turn to become a bad guy or a face turn to become more of a hero. To me, in this video, I think, and in this conversation today, we're talking about something much broader than just redemption arcs, and that's why I want to use the term face turns. Does that jive with your understanding of it?
Sure. I mean, like it's ultimately it's semantics, but the term that I personally think of in these situations is rehabilitation. Is that
Right,
the heroes help the villains to rehabilitate,
right,
and whether they redeem themselves or not is can be attached to that, but is a separate issue.
right. Well, and like to me, let me ask you this: like, I guess kind of what I'm trying to get at is to me, even rehabilitation is different than a villain who has decided to work with a hero against a bigger bad,
Sure. I mean
which is a lot of what they talk about in the video. That to me
that's
is like,
classic Dragon Ball, Dragon
yeah,
Ballism.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And in the MCU, it happens all the time, you know, and so many of these comic universes. Well, okay, so with that in our pocket, let's kind of go back to what we were talking about. And um, one of the things that I think is so interesting in what we're talking about there about Batman and this idea of creating his own villains, to me, this is a way in which I think it's very interesting to compare him to Iron Man. Because,
Okay.
and granted, there have been many different versions of both of these characters, But in some of my favorite versions of them, yes, sometimes they create them through their own individual decision making, like Val Kilmer Batman helping to create the Riddler, although he's pretty justified in that, um, uh, and Tony Stark creating particular individual villains through the way he runs his business, like in Spider-Man Far From Home and stuff like that. Um, but to me, a large part of their stories is about not the things they are doing individually, but the things that their companies are doing, sometimes under their direction, often largely under their father's directions in both of their cases, that helped create a lot of this villainy that they're now working on. And I think it's interesting that they take very different approaches to it, but in both cases, there's a sense of like their fathers were big capitalists, were doing all this kind of business stuff. In Tony Stark's, I think it's a little bit more direct because it's arms dealing, although in the Christopher Nolan movies, they go that exact direction with Batman as well. And then in both cases, like the son of the father is kind of looking at how do I not only deal with the kind of overall issue, but like my company that I now inherited from my father is doing these bad things that I want to try to make better.
Okay. I'm not fully following, so maybe I need some examples
Okay.
of where you're going with this.
So I guess where I'm going with it is, and it's somewhat of a tangent on this thing, but I guess I'm just saying I'm trying to draw a connection between a lot of the most modern portrayals of both Batman and Iron Man, in that both of them have fathers who were in charge of these large corporations that they have now inherited, Stark Industries or Wayne Industries, that particularly in the Christopher Nolan movies and in the MCU movies, that those companies were selling weapons, were selling a lot of things that were creating a lot of villains around the world, and that they are now trying to make up for some of that legacy and correct some of that legacy. And in many ways interrogate that legacy and wrestle with it, with Christopher Nolan Batman, but also somewhat the Robert Pattinson Batman, kind of looking not only at the arms dealing, but like in Robert Pattinson Batman, it's his father's corruption and involvement in corrupt politics. In Christopher Nolan Batman, it's all the weapons dealing. In Tony Stark's in Robert Downey Jr.'s Iron Man, the MCU's Iron Man, it's very much the weapons dealing. In both, it seems to me there's an interesting parallel there of they have an understanding for their villains in part because they see a lot of their villains as being created either by their fathers or by themselves through their business dealings.
Again, like when it comes to Iron Man, let's focus on Iron Man because I think he is the most weapons dealer ish guy. Like that's what they do, right? That's Stark Industries, as they sell weapons. In the beginning of the Iron Man movie, Tony Stark is on a sales pitch mission to the Middle East to sell the Jericho missiles. Right. So, and he's like fully on board. Like he's like, hey, like look at these great missiles. You know, that famous scene with the explosions behind him. I don't buy that he's like different from his father. Like he's fully in on this until he's kidnapped and has this realization like they're using my weapons for the wrong reasons, and now I have to change the focus of what Stark Industries is doing, and he has the conflict with Obadiah Stane.
Right.
So going into the movie, I feel like he is 100% on board and responsible for his actions and the actions of his company. And it's not like, oh no, like this terrible legacy my father left me, whatever will I do? He created that legacy, right?
Well, he kept building upon it. Yeah. No,
yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that's fair because certainly, and in both Batman and Pattinson versions, it's Bruce Wayne discovering his father's or what his company has done. You know, in Nolan, it's not his father, but it's the company since his father died. Okay.
Yeah, so I'm a little less tuned in on the specifics of Batman and like what he inherits and how he discovers it. So if there's something there, sure.
It was probably a tangent that we probably spent too long on. That's my fault. Getting back to this then. So we talk about Batman. in the video they build kind of this rubric of giving points for how many people different heroes have saved. And I don't want to get into the points and the specifics of it. I don't think it always lines up, but I think it's an interesting rubric.
No,
Um,
I mean, especially when you reference comic books,
yeah,
there's no way you know every single villain.
exactly, exactly. But what were some of the other kind of overall themes that they pointed out that you thought were interesting and worth discussion?
Well, it ends up the it goes like in reverse order from least to most.
Uh-huh.
And I guess like second place or like first place for individuals was interesting to me because it's Spider-Man.
Mm-hmm.
And very specifically in his latest movie, Spider-Man No Way Home, the idea of rehabilitating the villains is absolutely central to the plot of the movie. Like it's
Right.
the whole point,
Right.
basically. So I found it very interesting to explore Spider-Man's history in the comics as well of doing this and why he's number one.
Right.
And we can get to the real number one later. But I want to focus on Spider-Man because it is
Sure.
that movie, like being in the MCU, will be something that a lot of people have consumed and be familiar with. And I think the fact that the idea of rehabilitating his villains is so central to Spidey's character is
Right.
important.
Very much so. And I think we can kind of look on that on two levels. And one is the why is it that the writers of Spider-Man have made him in particular a character for whom that is so focused, but then also within the story itself. And so maybe let's start with within the story itself. What is it you see about Spider-Man that makes it so important for him?
Well, it all goes back to Uncle Ben, ultimately.
Yeah.
With great power comes great responsibility. And in the movie, it's Aunt May who delivers that message in her dying moment when they had been trying to help the villains, and then the
Right.
Green Goblin, Norman Osborn, betrays them, and he's the one who kills her. But Aunt May says, "No, like we were doing the right thing,"
Right.
and that's the internal conflict that Peter Parker has to wrestle with in the second half of the movie
Mm-hmm.
is his desire for vengeance against Green Goblin for killing Aunt May,
Right.
but wanting to honor her message and her legacy and saying, no, you have to help people.
Yeah.
That is why you have this power. And I think especially when it comes to superheroes
Mm-hmm.
who have power and helping people, like how do you help people? Is it just by defeating villains, right? And killing them? Like we talk about whether it's okay to kill villains or not, and 99% of the time I say no. But this takes the discussion one step further. Is like not only should we not kill them, we should seek to find ways to help them
Right.
so that they do not continue a path of villainy.
Right. Well, and one thing I think is so essential, and again, I will say I've not read many Spider-Man comic books. I think I watched a couple episodes of the TV show, the animated TV show, when I was a kid, but I do not remember it. But mostly, I've seen like all the Tobey Maguire and the oh god, what's the name of the guy who plays the after Tobey
Andrew Garfield.
Andrew Garfield. Thank you. I was like, it's something about a cat. Andrew Garfield, and then of course most recently Tom Holland. And and I think one of the things that they really strive to do, and this is again a parallel with Batman, I think, but even more so, is Spider-Man cares about why are these people villains, and I think it not coincidentally, almost all of the Spider-Man villains are shown to have some reason they are doing what they are doing, and the video hints at this, but I want to go even deeper at this. It feels like most Spider-Man villains can be grouped into one of two categories. One of which is people who have had some kind of terrible tragedy happen to them, and they are acting out in part as a result of that tragedy and the unhealed pain or trauma or the need to recover or something like that. Um, and that's kind of a like, well, so how much? There's sort of an argument of like, is this fully in their control? Because if they hadn't had this, or if they'd had more social help or something like that, would they have become these villains? And then the other side takes, and I think there's a lot of overlap, but takes it more literally of people who are on the margins. They've faced a tragedy. Something has happened, and so they're turning to science in a way to try and fix things, but without regulation, without safety, and then the science gets out of their control. And now their villainy is maybe inspired in part by things that were there before this, but they are being taken over by the science, and that's Green Goblin, Doctor Octavius becoming Doc Ock, um, Sandman, Electro, like so many Spider-Man villains. It seems like they were trying unsafe science, but were not fundamentally malicious or evil, but they were sort of felt pushed to do this unsafe science that then has now taken over and corrupted them. And so there's some degree to which you can say like there's some innocence that they have that makes them worthy of being redeemed and saved.
Yeah,
Does,
I
does
would
that
say
sound
Lizard fits that mold in the most classical sense of it's often portrayed as being a different personality, or at least
mm-hmm.
like the animalistic aspects of the personality take over
Yep.
Dr. Connors.
Yep.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things there. One concept I wanted to touch on was that Spider-Man villains tend to operate on the city level, right, of New
Right.
York City. They are not global or cosmic threats to like existence itself.
He's your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man.
Yeah, and the villains reflect that, and so the crime reflects that. Like often he's mostly just trying to stop people from robbing banks, type of
Right.
thing. And the reason he says that some of these villains are robbing banks is that they did science, it went wrong, and they want to continue funding their experiments. Maybe to find a cure in some cases, but
Mm-hmm.
in some cases maybe the villainy takes over and they're like, I kind of like this,
Right.
villainy thing, so I'm going to continue to do it, but I need more money.
Right.
But it's very, yeah, I think it's more, the villains are more relatable in that
Mm-hmm.
sense because they're not just trying to end the world or conquer the world. I
Right.
think, yeah, like Kingpin, right, is the biggest kind of global. He's still a city. He's still
Yeah.
city based. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think he's like it is. I get that why Spider-Man wouldn't have really fit the dynamic of the Netflix Defenders because that was so dark and that's not really Spider-Man. But in terms of scale, to me, that's much more where he fits. Than taking on the galactic and global, and to some extent, I think that is where he is positioned sometimes in the movies.
I
Um,
guess Venom. Venom is like takes on a cosmic scale because of the
right,
symbiote.
right,
Um, but even Venom has had interesting turns. Literally, like Eddie Brock becomes a character named Anti Venom. So there you go. He's like anti-hero
yeah,
and takes on like a more heroic stance to things. Largely because they replaced him with Carnage, who's just a psychopathic murderer.
right. And I think that this extends not only to Peter Parker, but to other versions of Spider Man. The one that I think is most known, and certainly that I know the most about, is Miles Morales. And in
Hmm.
both of the Spider Verse movies we've gotten, as well as I think a lot of the comics, in the first one, Kingpin is the villain. And yes, Kingpin is not controlled by science. He is fully in his right mind. But he is dealing with the tragedy of the loss of his wife and daughter, the wife and child. I think it's a son actually, but I don't remember. And it's somewhat his fault, but still he is trying to fix that at the end of the day, and that is a more understandable and relatable goal than just I want to take over the city, I want to be rich, I want to be powerful. And then in the second one, his primary antagonists are other spider people who think that they are also doing the right thing. And I just think that's really it really speaks to where Spider-Man comes from. I think that he wants to understand the motivation of his villains and understand they're not just terrible people. They're not. It's not just the world is good and bad people. It's that
Right.
kind of like a Batman thing. Doc Ock had a really bad day. He got fired by Green Goblin. He got all the science took over him. Dr. Connors had a bad day. A number of these Sandman had a really bad day, and then they turn to these options, and then that takes over.
Yeah. And for me, I think one of Spider-Man's superpowers is his compassion
Yeah.
or his understanding. Like it's the scenes where he talks to the villain and tries to relate to them and convince them, hey, maybe don't do this. It's like that's where I find Spider-Man the most powerful, like
Yeah.
as a character,
Right.
and that I end up enjoying the most.
Yeah. No, I
And
really get that.
that's why, yeah, like focusing on the movie No Way Home and kind of like, convincing those villains one by one, and of
Hmm.
course using the science to depower them as well. But it in some cases it is like with consent,
Right.
right? Especially like Doc Ock, he was fully on board with it and actually like helps them in the end, rehabilitate the other villains.
Right.
The most forced upon, I think, is probably Norman Osborn because
Hmm.
he's got that multiple personality thing. Like the Goblin persona has taken
Right.
over, and they have to overpower him and force him to take the cure.
Yeah. And that's again where, and I'm not saying this is a specific one-to-one analogy by any means, but I think that somewhat intentionally, there's a reference to larger questions of, in our own world, there's often sort of the question of like, when people are doing harmful things to themselves or to others when they're off their meds, for example, or something like that. Like, can you force them to go back on, and this kind of thing? And that is such a difficult question, and we'll wrestle with it in some other episode because it comes up a lot in these stories. To me, the way that that movie handled the consent of these people was so much better than I'm going to
Yeah.
mind control you to not use death sticks anymore, from Star Wars, or like what Professor X does all the time. It really wrestled with like, yeah, deciding who is the real you and then anything else, their choices are not legitimate, is a lot more complicated than we just want to often see it.
It is. And there's definitely uncomfortable aspects of forcing a cure upon people, right? And
Yeah.
if we get to real world things like issues of vaccination and all that, is like people wrestle with, okay, like, but if it's my body, my choice type of thing.
Right.
But the idea in both cases is that you have to evaluate things on the path of the greater good
Right.
for society.
Right. What's the harm not only that you might pose to yourself, but the harm you might cause to others?
Yeah.
Like
And
the. Go ahead.
if Green Goblin, like in his Green Goblin persona, just wanted to like go off in the woods and like do wacky science experiments and explode pumpkin bombs in an uninhabited area, no one would care. But the issue is that he flies his glider through New York City and throws pumpkin bombs in inhabited areas,
Right.
and that you have to stop that.
Yeah. And I want to put a pin in that because I really want to discuss that further because I think it's a big part of this question. But to say one of the things that I like about Spider-Man that this video doesn't cover, but I think is really important, um, for Batman, and I think this is more in the more mass media movies, less so in the animated show and in the comics. But a lot of times in the movies, the people who Batman is most interested in helping to rehabilitate are also the prettiest. The ones that he becomes romantically involved with. Catwoman is probably the most common. Harley Quinn, he doesn't ever become romantically interested in, but certainly there's that dynamic in how other parts of the universe are seen. And a couple of others. Mask of the Phantasm is one where he's trying to redeem someone who he's also kind of romantically interested in. There are a couple others. I really like that for Spider, and I think that's true for a lot of other heroes. I really like that. Daredevil with Elektra. I really like that for Spider-Man, with the exception of Black Cat, who is not really one we talk about very much because she's kind of lower on the list of this stuff. That's mostly not the case. Like most of the time, his romantic interests are Mary Jane or Gwen, who aren't people in need of being rehabilitated in that same way. And then a lot of times, the people who he's rehabilitating are people who were his mentors, like Doc Ock or Dr. Connors, or people who were his friends, in terms of Harry Osborn or Harry Osborn's father. Um, I just really like that for Spider-Man at least, they don't tie the rehabilitation into the romantic interest, which a lot of other heroes I think do.
I think that's I think that's cynical.
How so?
Just because like earlier in the discussion I talked about Harvey Dent, Two-Face.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, especially in the animated series, that is the most important villain
Agreed. And I started out
that
by saying
Batman
this
is
is this.
trying to rehabilitate.
I started out by saying this is mostly in the Batman movies, not as much in the animated series of the comics.
Okay. Well, I mean, in the movies, is he trying to rehabilitate anyone? That's the thing. Like movies.
I would say that in both Michelle Pfeiffer and I think it's Zoe Saldana, but both versions of Catwoman,
Zoe
both
Kravitz.
Zoe Kravitz, thank you. Both of those Catwomen are somewhat criminal who he is both flirting with and also to some extent trying to guide onto a more redemptive path. Mask of the Phantasm, an animated movie, which I mentioned, it's very much that. Um, Talia al Ghul. I think there's some aspect of that in the third of the Christopher Nolan movies.
Oh.
Um,
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I think what you're citing is a Catwoman issue,
mhm.
and yes, Catwoman is central to this discussion when you talk about Batman, but I I again like weighing like one character versus another, I guess,
Mhm.
but it's I don't know. I would not be like Batman just cares about getting some, and that's why he does this. Like that's
Yeah, I think that's a cynical reading of what I'm saying, but I don't think
yeah,
that's
but
what.
that is my spin on it. But
Right.
that is what you're saying is that the bat like in these moments like Batman is doing it because it's a love interest.
No, I don't think that's what I'm saying. And I would also say, like I said, I mentioned Daredevil. I think Batman to me is the example that most comes to mind, but I think to me Spider Man stands out as opposed to most heroes where this is a thing. Um, to me, it's not that the hero is like, oh, haha, if I can, reform this person, then I can, sleep with them or be romantically invested in them. I don't think it's that cynical at all. I think it's that, for the most part, the character or the writers are really like, it is the attractive woman character who is seen as has the potential for redemption, and that's what is written on this. That's what we get from the character.
Yeah, I mean,
In a way
I
that,
get that. I get that. But
yeah,
like that's Catwoman, and that's what that character is in Batman. And you kind of dismissed Black Cat, but she is literally like Catwoman in Spider-Man. And
sure,
you're right, she hasn't been in the movies. I mean, her character has been, but she has not existed as Black Cat.
right,
But in the comics and in the Spider-Man animated series from the 90s, there are huge arcs where there's this like will they won't they, like will he redeem her thing going on.
right,
So that I guess like yes, I think the Catwoman Black Cat archetype is something to explore and examine and be like, well, is this what is the motivation of the character?
hmm
But to say like Batman but not Spider-Man, I think is a very wrong. And then like other superheroes, like another person on this list, on the original list, was Captain America. I think he
right,
ranked very highly, and his central person that he tries to redeem is Bucky
right,
Barnes, the Winter Soldier, which to me is similar to the Harvey Dent storyline of like here's a best friend who through kind of no fault of his own, I guess, yeah, like no fault of his own, became a villain
yeah,
and is programmed to do evil, and Captain America goes to great lengths to save him from that.
hmm yeah.
And I cannot think of off the top of my head, I can't think of any examples of Captain America having a villainous love interest, but
I mean, I think many would say Bucky is his love interest, but yes, no, I very much agree with what you're saying. I guess Batman to me is more of an example of it. I think that Steve Rogers and Spider Man are the exceptions. That a lot of the time, and Daredevil, Electra is the other one that comes to mind, but I think there's others where it does. I do think that for a number of superheroes, redemption and romantic interest are often tied together in a way that, with the one exception of Black Cat, for the most part with Spider-Man, they are not. But yeah, we may disagree on that. That's fine. It's kind of a tangential thing here.
well, like you say for the most part, except Black Cat, but then like Batman, I guess you said Catwoman and Mask of the Phantasm.
Right. And Talia al Ghul, and
Talia al Ghul is complicated. I don't
Yeah.
know. I don't know if he's ever tried to redeem her. Like, yeah. Mostly, I feel like he's trying to redeem Damien from
Hmm.
Talia's influence.
Yeah.
His son, Damian Wayne, who becomes
Hmm.
a Robin.
Right. And again, I mean but that hasn't really appeared in the movies, which is the main thing I'm talking about here. Anyway, I think we just kind of we don't see it eye to eye, and that's totally fine. Um, let's go back to the point you were making though about the, um, the risks that sometimes happen here with when you're like, I think someone can be redeemed, because to me one of the most interesting things there, like you said, it's one thing if Green Goblin is harming himself. It's the issue that he is posing a danger to others that raises the question. And for me, the question that I think is really explored, the really interesting question of Spider-Man Far From Home, one of them, is not just how does his desire for redemption and Aunt May's desire pushing him in that direction come up against his desire for vengeance, but also if I think I can save someone, and in part because of that, I don't put the hammer down or I give them a chance to do good, and in some ways facilitate them causing more harm, to what extent am I now responsible for the additional harm they're causing? And this is the Obi-Wan letting Vader live, now not once but twice. This is the kind of, Peter Parker trying to rehabilitate the criminals, but that to some extent lets them free again. And Aunt May lets him off the hook, and I think because she says, like, no, I'm glad you did this, I don't blame you for it. But do you think there's an interesting question there of when a hero kind of gives a villain another chance to try and do the right thing, are they responsible when the villain doesn't do the right thing or does do bad again?
No. And I think I've always been consistent on this, is that no, I don't think the hero is responsible. They can feel guilt. I think that's an important part of the journey for
Mm-hmm.
them. I think it's important for the heroes to feel guilt in that moment because it's good television, but also I think it's good character.
Right.
But absolutely, like I think every time this comes up, I'm just like, no, they're not responsible. Like a villain is responsible for their own actions.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, if if I know someone has a history of drinking and driving, and they tell me, no, 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 don't worry, this time I have finally quit drinking, and I hand them the keys to my car, like, to me, I hold some responsibility there. And I feel like, yeah, at the end of the day, the villain is always going to be the one who's the most responsible. But I do feel that, like, when you have a chance to prevent a person from doing further harm, and you don't because you think they can be rehabilitated, I feel like it incurs a responsibility on yourself to do all you can to prevent them from doing harm again. And when that is a ethical issue that's tied into attempting to rehabilitate people, and that I want to be very careful there because I think that's an argument that leads towards the death penalty and stuff like that, and that's not what I'm saying at all. But it's to me the idea of, like, how do you find ways to rehabilitate people while also keeping them off the streets, or keeping them in positions where they can't do the harm again until they've been fully rehabilitated.
Well, I think we've run into these issues in our everyday lives in all kinds of situations, and none of us, well, I don't know, dear listeners, but
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to say none of us are superheroes.
Yep, that's true.
And if we see someone doing harm or we suspect they're going to do harm, like, I don't think we have a responsibility to stop them,
Right.
because in attempting to do so, we may put ourselves in harm's way. Like that's the whole like argument of like Good Samaritan laws and those types of situations, is that you have to watch out for yourself and not put yourself in dangerous situations. And then there's like the question of what authorities can you report to,
Right.
like an incident, to de-escalate a situation or help people. And that's a difficult question.
Yeah.
in this day and age, and maybe any age, but there's certainly an argument to be made that some authorities do not have the best interests of the public or certain individuals, and calling the authorities in to certain situations will only make a situation worse or potentially put people at risk of harm. It's complicated, and so this is why I continue to come down on like no responsibility. It's kind of like a blanket statement, because even like in the hero situation, that you don't know what's going to happen. You have to, if you're a hero, you have to act in like what you think is the best way. And in these situations, the heroes have decided that they believe the best way is to try to help someone.
Right.
And there are consequences, and those consequences can be very bad in these storylines. People die in these storylines because of the consequences of what the heroes did or didn't take as actions. And again, like they carry that guilt. I'm going to push back on that they bear any responsibility for it, but they carry that guilt, and that changes who they are and how they react to future situations. And it kind of goes on to define their character. Like I think of the Bucky Barnes Captain America, Steve Rogers, at the end of Winter Soldier, the movie Winter Soldier. Captain America could basically take down Bucky, right?
Yeah.
He could beat him up and arrest him or whatever, but he kind of chooses to let Bucky beat him up because he's like, I'm not going to do this. Like, you're my friend. And that in the story, like that helps kind of reawaken the good Bucky.
Right.
But it lets Bucky escape in that situation. And then in the next movie, Civil War, it appears that the Winter Soldier has assassinated T'Chaka, the king of Wakanda. Right? It ends up not being true. But throughout that movie, like Captain America has to struggle with that I let this guy go. And now, like, I think he does feel responsibility. Then that's why he does what he does and tries to catch Bucky on his own. Right. So that's, I don't know. Like, I don't think when we talk about the issue of responsibility, I think I try to divide it up into two things, like legal responsibility or however you want to frame that, and then like personal. And in terms of the personal, I think Captain America feels that responsibility, so he tries to address that by catching Bucky. But do I, the outsider, like hold Captain America responsible and be like, well, you shouldn't have let him go in that previous movie? Like, no, like that he had the power and agency in that situation, and that's the decision he made, and he has to live with that.
Yeah. I see what you're saying. I guess to me what it comes down to is I think that we all get to make decisions about the risks that we take. And this is both in terms of like if someone wants to take, a whole bunch of drugs or do things that are very dangerous, I think any person should get to be able to take whatever risks they want to themselves. And that both applies to, doing terrible things to yourself, but it also applies to if I want to help somebody who's been very violent rehabilitate themselves and put myself in a situation where if they do keep being violent, they're going to be violent towards me, I'm taking that risk. I'm choosing to take that risk. But when you're saying I have the chance to prevent this person from doing further violence, but I'm going to put them in a situation where they could because I think it will help them to not do it anymore, and I trust that they won't do it anymore, their potential villains, their potential victims didn't get to make that decision. You've consented to take that risk, but the people who they're also possibly harming haven't. And I think that's where, and to me the most extreme example is where, like, I think that a lot of, and again, I don't believe responsibility is a zero-sum game, and so I never want to take away from that. Darth Vader is responsible for every single person Darth Vader killed. End of story. But also, Obi-Wan, as we now have it in canon, twice had an opportunity to end Vader or some other way prevent Anakin / Vader from going on to do the terrible things he does, and he didn't. And I think we can look at him and say, Obi-Wan, you carry some of the responsibility for what happened, therefore. And I guess to me that's what, and I really liked how it was addressed in No Way Home, is it felt like it was sort of pushing Peter to look at, hey, wait a minute, you trusted these people, and that comes from the very best place. But when you trust these people and your ability to rehabilitate them, are you putting others at risk, and what does that mean?
Hmm. Yeah, I agree that that's what the story is saying to us.
Mm-hmm.
And then the two other Spider-Mans
Right.
basically convince him or tell him that it's the right thing to do, even despite the consequences. And it's a difficult pill, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But for that story, I found it beautiful. I think it's a good sentiment to have in general.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Well, do you want to? We're almost in an hour. Do you want to turn to the last of the what he names as like the winner in his contest of who has redeemed the most, and it's a group.
Yeah, number one will surprise you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, because it's a group, so it's hard to pin down like how and when. But it is broadly just the X-Men.
Yeah.
And it's because basically like the X-Men and their villains are the same. And that line has blurred more and more in recent comics with the Krakoa storyline, where they form a mutant nation that includes former X-Men and former Brotherhood of Mutants or whoever, up to and including Apocalypse.
Right.
One of the all-time big bads of the X-Men is a member of Krakoa. And they generally try to do good or are heroic, but mostly like what ends up happening with X-Men is like their definition of doing good, I think, is focused on mutant kind and protecting mutants. And so it does often put them in conflict with human society. And of course, there are like the evil elements of human society that are trying to eradicate mutants using sentinels and such. But there's also just kind of like run of the mill situations where there's conflict, and the X-Men will always favor the mutants, right? Of protecting mutant kind because they're a persecuted people.
Right. Yeah, I feel like we never actually said this word, but I think so essential to both the Spider-Man and Batman, as we're talking about, is empathy, and is the ability to both Spider-Man and Batman and other heroes can put themselves in the shoes of someone else and say, okay, I understand why you made these decisions, and it makes it easier for me to see the good in you and to not just hate you and want to punish you. And I feel like with the X-Men, it goes even further because, as you said, every, especially when they're fighting other mutants, every other mutant who Magneto faces has faced the discrimination and hatred that against mutants that Magneto has. They haven't felt it on other elements in the Holocaust and things like that, but they can sympathize with what Magneto is going through and why Magneto feels the way he does and why Apocalypse feels the way they do. And I didn't see it coming. And first when they put up the picture, I thought they were going to do Professor X, and I was going to get like, oh, mind control is not redemption. Let's be very clear here. But I like that direction because to me that's the real key is redemption becomes easiest when you best understand where the villain is coming from, and that's also easiest when you're like them, when you've gone through what they've gone through.
Yeah, there's a reason the phrase Magneto was right is so popular within X-Men fandom. And the membership of the X-Men historically, I mean, you got Emma Frost, I think, is one of the classic cases of she was a villain. She was like one of the members of the Hellfire Club, but then she goes on to be a teacher, and I think even at one point headmistress of the academy. Rogue started off as a villain, I think a Captain Marvel villain. That's where she got her powers from. She stole Captain Marvel's powers. Mystique, especially in the movies.
Yep.
right? Jennifer Lawrence Mystique has bounced back and forth between both sides,
Mm-hmm.
and Magneto himself,
Yep.
is always teaming up with the X-Men against a greater evil. Usually, again, like usually it's the Sentinels. It's like, okay, this is the one where we all have to band together because they
Right.
just want to kill all of us.
Right. And that also gets into the questions I wanted to discuss in a future episode of what's the difference between recognizing that you were wrong and wanting to make things better versus recognizing that the differences you have between someone else are small compared to the great danger that's facing both of you. But yeah, I definitely think in terms of the X Men, like it especially with Krakoa, it feels like it's much more that second. You know, Magneto and Apocalypse aren't saying, "Oh, we were wrong and Professor X was right." They were saying, "We can kind of put aside our differences because if we all just live in this one nation together, then we can kind of our differences don't really matter because we're separating ourselves from human society anyway."
Mhm. And we see it in the X-Men 97 cartoon, a kind of sequel reboot of the old cartoon where Charles bequeaths his academy to Magneto and he becomes the headmaster.
Right.
And for part of the run leads the X-Men, right? And so I know Magneto often is seen as like a team up of convenience, like you said, like the Dragon Ball issue of like, well, there's a greater evil, and I mentioned like Sentinels, but I think that X-Men 97 cartoon does a really good job of showing like the reconciliation with
Right.
Magneto.
Right.
It's that he's a really hard one to say redeem or even rehabilitate. It's really a reconciliation where both sides kind of move towards each other.
Yeah.
In so many of these other cases, the hero is like pure and absolutely right, and they redeem the villain. But in this case,
Right.
like they come much closer to each other, and that's true in a lot of the comics too. Like Cyclops, Scott Summers moves a lot more to villainy through his
Yeah.
association with Magneto in a lot of the storylines.
I mean, certainly Wolverine, I don't think is ever a villain necessarily, but is often somewhat of an anti-hero, or at least, a lot of the story is about his idea of what he should do with his powers is very different than Charles Xavier's, and them coming closer, and sometimes, it being that he moves to where Professor X is, but sometimes also where they both move towards where the other is, and sort of compromise and
Yeah,
find a way to the middle.
Wolverine to me mostly just feels selfish, I guess, in his stories.
Mm-hmm.
In that he's kind of like the Hulk. He's like, just I want to be left alone.
Right. Yeah, he's much more a Han Solo figure than a like if you look at Star Wars, I think you can Han Solo has a face turn, but he's never a true heel. He's just a I just don't care, and then he decides to become a hero. And I think that's much more
Hmm.
where Wolverine is in terms of the journey he goes on.
Yeah, I think that's a good comparison.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Han Solo,
Exactly. Exactly.
one of the worst. That's my least favorite retcon. Like, I don't know if it's a retcon, but just like
Giving him his
explanation of convenience.
yeah, it's I have said before that I think the movie Solo is a very good science fiction heist film if you view it as existing in its own universe that has no connection to any other existing universe. Um, in that regard, I think it is a very good movie. If you try to make it a Star Wars story, it totally breaks down for me. But that's a whole other story.
But if it weren't for that movie, we wouldn't be having this conversation, I think. Because it's
Percent.
because of the movie Solo that at the end of that movie, Darth Maul just shows up out of the
Mm-hmm.
blue. And I had only watched the movies. I
Right.
was like, what the heck is going on? And then people explained to me, oh yeah, like there's this whole, I think at the time, 6 season cartoon. And
Mm-hmm.
Darth Maul survived Phantom Menace and he's in the cartoon a lot. I was like,
Yeah.
oh, okay. And that led me to you, and we
Yeah.
covered that, the Clone Wars, and here we are.
There. That's
So
true.
you can thank Solo.
thank Solo
Or
for
blame
the great
Solo.
podcasting. However you want to look at it. Well, I'll thank Solo. Like I said, I think it's a fun movie to watch. I just need to not connect it to Star Wars, and other people do, and that is totally fine as well. There's no right or wrong opinions there. Um, like I said, I think this topic of redemption and face turns and all that is going to be one we revisit. Any other last things you want to have on this particular conversation about heroes who are able to redeem or help or rehabilitate villains?
Yeah, I just want to kind of pull back again and explore the whole topic and say why I value this so much is that when you have stories where the hero tries to relate to the villain and help the villain, that is character defining for the hero and what
Yeah.
that means. And these people, these characters are presented to us as examples. Right? I think like ultimately that's why we like stories like this. Like this is an example of a hero. Like we use that word in real life to define people who do good things. And we often relate it back to these superheroes. So saying like this is what a hero is, like this is what a hero should do, is a powerful form of storytelling to me. And that's why I value these stories. I know that because of the way continuity works, that rehabilitation for villains often doesn't stick because 2 years later you want to reuse that villain and have them be a villain in a storyline again.
Mm-hmm.
So there are very few examples where it really works and they stay on the good side.
Right.
I think in the Ant's video, Captain America was the one where it seemed to stick the most because when he rehabilitates villains, it's through the lens of like getting them to join the Avengers, right? Scarlet Witch, Quicksilver, Winter Soldier. So like he seems to have the best record for things that stick because he gets them to join the Avengers, and that's a huge part of Cap's character. He might not have had the highest count, but maybe we could argue that he's got the best success.
Yeah.
Out of all of them for that reason. The X-Men is interesting because again, like everyone, like good and bad mutants by whatever definition, like end up joining together in a lot of cases. So it's hard to say, what's happening there. And like we touched upon it. That I think that could be a very good long discussion. Is like what happens when the good guys and the bad guys join forces? Right? I think we might talk about that.
Yeah. No, I think that's true because I think that is often one of the biggest of the kinds of face turns or redemptions that can happen, and talk about like, what does that mean, and especially when it's do they join forces because the villains have decided to stop be villains, or do they? And I think these are some of the stories I like most. Like I think the Arrowverse did some interesting job exploring this, where the villains were like, okay, we're gonna work with you because there's this much bigger bad, and we'll stop doing terrible things while we're helping you. But then at the end of the day, we're going to go back to being villains. You're going to go back to being heroes, and that's how it's going to be.
Oh, okay. You mentioning the Arrowverse has triggered something in me. And I'm rewatching. Sarah's watching for the first time Smallville, which predates the Arrowverse and was really kind of like the first big superhero TV show of this new era.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, the best part of this show is the relationship between Clark Kent and Lex Luthor.
Yes.
We're into season 4, and throughout these first 4 seasons, they constantly call each other, you're my best friend, Clark or Lex, and they have these conflicts, but they keep coming back to each other, and it's my favorite portrayal of the character Lex Luthor. I did enjoy the performance in Superman 2025. But like as a character study, I think like this is the best Lex Luthor.
Yeah. Well, that's great to know because I stopped watching Smallville, I think in season 2, because it is a show that I think in some ways has not aged well. But there's a lot of great things in it, and I did love the Lex Luthor characterization. So that makes me probably want to go back and watch it again. And hopefully, because I miss having Sarah on these conversations, so we can talk about maybe if she'd be interested in talking about that with us. But yeah, I think you're right. I think that's it. But yeah,
and it relates back to this because he's not like Lex Luthor on the show, at least at this point, season 4, has not gone to villainy. but
Yeah.
constantly there's this struggle. He has this internal struggle. He talks about like the darkness in me. And he
Right.
says to Clark, like, your friendship is like one of the things that keeps me wanting to be good.
Yeah.
And Clark has the struggle of believing him. Like, but you keep doing these things, but I want to believe you. I want to be your friend. I want to be there for you. And so like it's like a if we're talking about redemption, it's like a pre-redemption. It's like trying to stop him from slipping
Right.
into villainy. And I
And that
love
gets
it.
into another, I think, question of that that's really interesting, where it's not even about the redemption. It's more like you said, the slipping. One of my favorite X-Men stories is X-Men First Class.
Oh yeah,
Um,
exactly.
and in that, at the start, Magneto and Charles Xavier are both heroes as it's portrayed, but they have very different approaches.
Hmm.
And Xavier kind of wants a purity of being heroic that Magneto isn't comfortable with. Purity sounds like a judgmental term. I think the movie does a really good job of showing like you could side with either one of them. But I think it's a similar thing of like, you know, are you trying to do the right, what to what extent does the ends justify the means when you're trying to do good? And that I think is a whole story of, that's Mask of the Phantasm. That's so much of the Jedi stories. That's we can get into all that. Um, Let me just kind of take it back to what you were saying though, because I think these two last points I want to make. One, in terms of what you're saying about being a hero, I think you're right. I think it's my favorite part of this story is the idea that we are, I think any kind of keeping score on heroes is kind of ridiculous. But that instead of saying how many bad guys did they kill, we're saying how many potential bad guys did they save. And to me, that's another version of we win by protecting what we love, not fighting what we hate. And I really like that idea of the hero. But I also thought what you said was maybe really illustrative of a lot of the differences you and I have. Because you
Hmm.
talked about why this is so important to you in terms of what it says about heroes. For me, it is so important because of what it says about villains.
Oh, okay.
Because
Go on.
I think one of the most harmful ideas out there that, has been in higher or lower at different times, but is certainly very much kind of in vogue and waxing right now, is the idea that there are just good people and bad. And, the best way to stop a bad person with a gun is a good person with a gun. And that there are, good immigrants and bad immigrants and good, whatever it is, that there are just good people and bad people. And I think that's an incredibly dangerous idea. I think it's incredibly dangerous in your personal life in terms of how you view people, and I think it's very dangerous in larger scopes. And I really like stories that focus on the idea that, like, to me, the best villain, I've always said, is one where I can look at it and go, I haven't taken step 10 on the path you're on, but I've taken step 1 or 2, and I can probably understand why someone would take step 3 without realizing it's a problem. And being able to recognize that, like, yeah, I think a lot of people can have a very bad day and not become evil or problematic or however you want to describe it, even though any of those terms is an issue in and of itself. But that you can understand that, yeah, if you have the only way you can possibly keep the love of your life alive is to preserve her frozen and thus to wind up having to do all these terrible things to others to keep her alive, or that the only way you can get your wife and daughter back wife and child back is to build this reality smashing machine that maybe it's going to kill everyone, but it might save your wife and child, so it's worth taking that risk. Those people do incredible harm. They're villains, but I can relate to them. I can understand them. And I think doing that makes it easier not only to move us away from wanting to punish the bad people, but to help us recognize, like, we all have that potential, and how do we stop that? And so to me, I just think it's interesting. You focus on the hero, I focus on the villain, but I think it's both ways in which these face turn stories are so important and really thought provoking.
No, I really like the way you put that, especially of not being reductive as
Mm-hmm.
to groups of people as like good or bad,
Right.
like as a whole, or even just like the good or bad sections. Because, yeah, like
Mm-hmm.
someone who does a bad thing, like someone who commits a crime, committed a crime, that's a bad thing. But are they a bad person?
Right.
That's very reductive and does make it easy to ignore the possibility. of rehabilitation,
Right.
right? If you just define them, okay, you're a criminal, you're a bad person, hence, like, we don't have to consider your human rights anymore. Like, that's terrible. And we should be seeking to, and I think, like, this is the flip side of that coin, is like, if we consider ourselves the heroes of our own story, as everyone
Right.
does,
Yeah.
um, then we should be seeking for ways to rehabilitate the quote unquote villains in our lives, like the people around us. And again, like, I'm not trying to say that that's easy. Um, like, if someone breaks into your home and steals from you, and, like, let's say they're caught,
Hmm.
you have been violated. Your home has
Yeah.
been violated. It's scary, and that you do have to struggle with that sense of feeling of vengeance.
Yeah.
Like, I want the law to come down on this person, like, in the full force.
Hmm.
But take a moment to try to understand who that person is and why they did it. Because unfortunately, like, a lot of people are in dire straits financially, drug addiction, and it leads them to do things that are bad. Like, I'm not trying to excuse that,
Right.
but maybe there's a way that they can be helped that will move them from that path.
Yeah.
And that's not easy. Like, it's much easier to just say, yeah, lock them up, get rid of them, and get them out of your life. And they don't have to be in your life, but you know what I mean. Is like,
Yeah. Well, and I think I very much think that, and I think this is kind of tying to our own world, but I think kind of very illustrative of what we're talking about. My parents were both lawyers, and they talked to me a lot about the law. And I remember as a young kid watching some legal shows with them and stuff like that. I never understood why, when like there was a criminal case, the case was described as the people of New York versus this person.
hmm,
And thinking like, well, yeah, like if you kill Joe, shouldn't it be Joe's family against that person? Or like if you rob from Joe, shouldn't it be Joe against that person?
hmm,
And the point that my parents made that I think is backed up in legal jurisprudence, this is why it is the people versus, is because of course an individual victim or a group of victims is going to see red. When like I think it is very valuable for us to say, why do people do crimes? And what is it, why is it that people who don't have economic options turn to crime sometimes? Not all of them by any means, not a majority of them, but that, you know, people who have a lot of economic options are a lot less likely to turn to crime as a way to, get enough money to eat. You don't do that if getting enough money to eat isn't an issue. And so I can, as an intellectual issue, say, therefore, if we don't want people to break into each other's homes and steal from them, creating situations where they have other economic opportunities and they're not doing that as a survival tactic helps.
yeah,
But as you said, if they
it's
break into my home, I don't think it's fair to expect me to see it that way. I'm going to feel
right.
violated. I'm going to feel hurt.
Yeah.
And I think it's fine for me to say, I want those people punished.
Hmm.
But, and I hope my friends say, you're totally right. Like, you're totally legitimate to feel that angry about people.
Yeah, no, it is
And thank
legitimate.
God. And then, but the flip side being, thank God you don't therefore get to decide the criminal justice system. You know, that like that vengeance should, it is logical for us to feel that vengeance, and good for us to have a legal system where the people aren't angry. New York State isn't angry at the killer or the murderer or whatever it is, or the robber, but they still want to see them, a justice system enacted.
Hmm. All
All right,
right. This
I think
was a
that's
good one. And I want to shout out again Anthony Gramuglia. The YouTube channel is at a Gramuglia, Agramuglia. I loved this video, and I've watched a few other of his videos because I love
yep.
watching videos about superhero things, and just felt like this one really fit our wheelhouse well.
Yeah. No, I think this was a great find. And like I said, I think this opens up a number of further discussions that we can get into that I'm really excited to dig into. So, yeah, and I would say other people definitely check out other things that Anthony does. I haven't viewed many of his videos, but I took a quick look at some of the others and thought there were some interesting points. Some I might agree with, some I might not, but definitely interesting conversation. I don't think I'm going to get him on here because his following is significantly larger than ours. But if people do follow him and want to tag him in this video or anything like that, I'll certainly probably write something to him and say, hey, just want to let you know you inspired this conversation. Thank you. And would love to have him on at some point. So long shot, but putting out into the universe. If you want to help make that happen, do that. Of course, you can become a member of this podcast, which allows you to get ad-free episodes. Who wants to hear ads in the middle of conversations? $5 a month, $55 a year gets that for you. Please think about supporting us in any of the other ways you can. Let people know, share, like, all those things. But most importantly, let the force be with you.